Hi everyone, it's Nick back for another tier list. Today I'm going to be ranking one of my personal favorite directors, Stanley Kubrick. I'm going to be ranking his 13 films from my least favorite to my favorite, and I'm going to be putting them into different tiers based on how I feel about them and how I feel they stack up against each other. But before I get into the tier list, please do me a favor and hit the subscribe button and stay up to date on all new upcoming content on this channel. So let's begin the tier list. Let's start with the tier list itself. I've separated the tier list into F, E, D, C, B, A, S. I feel like this is the perfect amount of tiers to separate these films. So if it's on the lower tier, that's not saying it's bad. It's just comparing it to other Kubrick films, it is bad. There's only one film in F tier that we're going to be talking about, and that's the first film, number 13 on this list. My least favorite Stanley Kubrick movie, Fear and Desire. Fear and Desire is a really hard movie to watch. It's really cringe how kind of bad it is. The acting's pretty bad, and the story and the production value and the plot and the filmmaking itself is pretty amateur. It's about these four guys who are soldiers in an unknown war, and they're behind enemy lines in an unknown country. They plan to build a raft to get to safety, but then decide to create a plan where they ambush the enemy lines, and they also run into this helpless woman who they have to unfortunately kidnap because they are afraid that she will reveal their location to the enemy. This film is not really entertaining, nor is it engaging, nor is it really trying to say anything important. It's just not that good of a movie. It's his first movie, Stanley Kubrick's first movie. There was a point where he was so ashamed of this movie that he tried to buy every single copy of this film and destroy it so no one could see it. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Yeah, this movie it's pretty disappointing that Stanley Kubrick made this movie, considering he's such a good filmmaker, but this movie itself is pretty bad. It's only a little over an hour, but it's really tough to watch. There are some parts of it that are admirable. You can see the inner workings of how Stanley Kubrick thinks as a director in terms of shot compositions, which aren't really fully realized in this film, but you can see that he's working on an artistic voice in this movie. Yeah, really, like, Fear and Desire is like a big step below all of the rest of this film, so let's talk about those instead. So on the E tier, there's only going to be one film on the E tier. It's Killer's Kiss. Killer's Kiss is going to be the film that's on E tier. It's a step above Fear and Desire, but it's still not quite as good as the rest of the movies, so it's going to be the only one on this tier. It's in 12th place. While that was an amateur movie, Killer's Kiss seems like the first real directorial debut of Stanley Kubrick, because the filmmaking itself is much more polished than Fear and Desire, even though the movie itself is not really as revered as some of his other movies. You can still see that his shot composition improved, his story narratives improved, the way he uses the camera is more creative, the performances he gets out of the actors are better. In almost every way, a step above Fear and Desire. This film is about a boxer, witnesses a guy trying to sexually assault one of his workers at this restaurant, but he sees it across the hall in his apartment and into their apartment. He falls for the girl, and they plan to leave town together on a train, but the guy, her boss, who was sexually assaulting her, sends his goons to try to stop them and, just have the girl for himself, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. But the film is kind of exciting in some ways. I like his use of locations. Like, the climax of the film is in a mannequin shop or a mannequin warehouse, which is pretty unique, and I like the way he uses mirrors in this film. He uses mirrors in a fun, creative way that reveal visual information. It doesn't have a lot to say. It's just a well done film. So that's why, even though when I think Fear and Desire is a poorly done film, which is why Fear and Desire is on F tier, Killer's Kiss, while it is generic and not really in the vein of Stanley Kubrick or what we think about when we think about Stanley Kubrick, it's still a well done film. So it does belong a tier above Fear and Desire, in my opinion. So next we're going to go on to D tier. These movies are the Stanley Kubrick movies that are quintessential Stanley Kubrick. These are the films that when you think of Stanley Kubrick, these are the films that people mention or talk about when they talk about Stanley Kubrick. And we're going to the bottom of those movies, which is D tier. These are the ones that I feel the most indifferent about. Some of these are some people's personal favorite Stanley Kubrick movies. I think the ones above D tier are just stronger in a lot of ways. And this is kind of hard to rank them like this and to kind of even call these films D tier films because they're still, compared to other movies, they're A tier or S tier. But when you have a filmmaker like Stanley Kubrick, who has such a great filmography, even though a short filmography, a great one nonetheless, it makes it hard to put films that you like so high when there's so many good films to pick from. So with that being said, we're going to go to the first film on D tier, my 11th favorite Stanley Kubrick movie, and that is Spartacus. Spartacus is a movie that initially Stanley Kubrick wasn't going to direct, but the original director had a falling out with production and stopped making the movie as they were filming. Kirk Douglas suggested Stanley Kubrick direct this film. This is a really long movie. This movie is 3 hours and 17 minutes long. It's about Spartacus, who was a slave who is sold to become a gladiator. And when he's training to become a gladiator, he leads this slave revolt and begins this slave revolution where he's going around and freeing all the slaves. And in Rome, this is causing problems for like the upper elites. They start concocting a plan to defeat Spartacus, and the ingenuity of those politicians is ultimately Spartacus's downfall. Kirk Douglas is really engaging as Spartacus. Stanley Kubrick has this visual language that I think is in his other films that I don't think are in his low 3 films. So I think Fear and Desire, Killer's Kiss, and Spartacus don't have this, and like one other film that I'll get to eventually, don't have the same visual language that the other films that Stanley Kubrick made has created, where like you can put it on and you can see his use of one point perspective and other filmmaking techniques that are kind of absent in Spartacus, Killer's Kiss, and Fear and Desire. So I think that might be part of the reason why I think they're probably the 3 lowest films on my list. And I think these films are on most people's list as the 3 lowest films. But I still think Spartacus is really fun and really action-packed and really epic film. It won multiple Oscars, and I think rightly so. He would get so fed up with the studio production process. For the rest of his career, he made sure that he had absolute creative control over the rest of his movies, which I think ultimately works out to everyone's favor because his movies end up becoming masterpieces. So with that being said, let's move on to the next film. The 10th film in my Stanley Kubrick ranking, A Clockwork Orange. So this is kind of where my personal opinion might differ drastically from someone else, because this is a really controversial thing that I'm doing right now, is putting Clockwork Orange so low on the tier list and on my personal rankings. I never really identified with this film as strongly as I do some of his other films. This film is about this young man who has a kind of fascination or liking to the ultra-violent. He and his friends get high off of spiked milk, and then they go and they cause violence and mayhem and rape and assault our protagonist, played by Malcolm McDowell, he gets arrested because he's such a terrible person, commits all these crimes. When he's arrested, he is given this treatment, this Pavlovian kind of treatment that kind of conditions him to not be violent, and this creates, whenever he has violent thoughts or is about to do something violent, he becomes physically ill, and he also, as a result, he becomes physically ill when he listens to music because of this treatment. This causes him, when he comes back into society, not being able to acclimate back into the world, because he keeps getting physically ill because of this new treatment, and because everyone else that he has hurt in the past now is getting the better of him and not helping him, even though he is weak at this point. Eventually, the treatment gets reversed out of a series of events, and it's hinted at that our character will return to a life of violence and cruelty. So why I rank this movie lower, I think this film is a little more gratuitous than the rest of the films, even though I understand that that's the point of this movie, is to be gratuitous and to be out there and to be zany and to be like really kind of weird in a way. It goes too far. I know a lot of people like this movie. That's fine if you do. I personally don't. I understand that the performances are great, and I do like this movie. I don't want to say don't like this movie. I do like this movie. It's just compared to his other films, not so much. But I would definitely recommend this. Some of the shots are pretty iconic, especially the shot where he attacks his friend, and the opening shot where they're against the wall. It's a really creative and interesting film. It's a different film from what you're normally used to. The way he does time lapses in this film is also pretty unique as well. And that's another thing I'll say about this film. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out and let me know what you think about Clockwork Orange. Again, a lot of people like this one. If you do, that's okay. I like it too, just not as much as the other films. At number 9, we have Full Metal Jacket. Again, this is another one that a lot of people really like and might even be some people's personal favorite. The film is about the Vietnam War and about these group of soldiers that train for a military camp for Vietnam, and then they also go to Vietnam and have a storyline there too. The film is separated into two parts. There's two parts to this film. The first part's the first 40 minutes or so. It's about their life in boot camp. The first 40 minutes deal with a lot of psychology and reminds you of like an abusive teacher and student relationship. It's really intense. It ends with Private Pyle assassinating the drill sergeant and killing himself, which is really intense and makes you wonder what Kubrick really thinks about war and what he chooses to include in his war films. The second half is about more about Private Joker and his journey in Vietnam, which climaxes with him and his squad getting pinned down by a young female sniper, which is also really intense in its own way. It's more of like intense in the moment of battle in war and not so much psychologically intense as the first 40 minutes were. Full Metal Jacket is a really good film, a really good war film with really strong themes. The first half of Full Metal Jacket is better than the second half. I think the first half has more creative ideas, and the second half kind of doesn't, and the story is more told on its face. I just don't think some of the ideas in the film work to their full potential. It's a very intense film, and it's an emotionally draining film, but because I think personally that his other films are slightly better than Full Metal Jacket, we're ranking Full Metal Jacket pretty low. At number 8, we have Lolita. I was surprised at how much I really enjoyed Lolita. The film is about a professor who rents a room in a small town where he lives with a mother and her young 14-year-old daughter. The professor then becomes sexually attracted to the 14-year-old daughter, which is unfortunate because the mother of the daughter is the one who's attracted to him. The film's protagonist is played by James Mason, who I think is a really good actor, and he's a really theatrical actor. Eventually, he professes his love to the 14-year-old girl, and the mother is very upset about it, and the professor is left with the 14-year-old girl to pursue his desires with her. Eventually, they start traveling together. They have disagreements, they have small fights. It doesn't end up being too serious. Mainly the crux of the fights is that he's obsessing over her, which is 100% true. People begin to question their relationship, and it causes him to be stressed out and causes him to panic and want to continue to travel so no one recognizes them. Eventually, there's a falling out, and there's a surprise where she ends up leaving him out of nowhere. And it's a really bizarre, taboo, interesting film. Kubrick is really good at creating sympathy for the professor. The film starts really strong. Kubrick separates himself from the novel Lolita by how he structures the story in this film. The film begins where chronologically would be the ending of the film. The film begins with the professor killing the man who took Lolita away from him. And then the rest of the film is a flashback to how he met Lolita and how he had the falling out with Lolita. It really sets up the story in a very interesting way where you're constantly questioning how he gets to this point that you already know he's going to reach. I highly recommend Lolita. I think it is a very smart and oddly charming film. It's not as strong as some of his other films, so for that reason, Lolita is going to be at the top of D tier. Now we're going to go to C tier. C tier is the middle of the road Stanley Kubrick films. Now, like I said, all these films are great. I just think these films, while the last 4 films in D tier are really good, there are 1 or 2 things about them that felt off. Like Spartacus, it was too long and it felt too studio driven and not so much a Stanley Kubrick film. In Clockwork Orange, I think some of the scenes were a little overly gratuitous. In Full Metal Jacket, the narrative is a little uneven because the first 40 minutes is a completely different and better movie. And in Lolita, Lolita is a strong literary adaptation. The execution and the uniqueness of the film isn't quite fully realized. When I'm going to talk about C tier, I think these 2 movies don't really have those problems. These 2 movies are very narratively tight. The way Kubrick approaches the filmmaking in these 2 movies maybe is a little more safe, but there's less flaws and less questionable moments in the approach to the storytelling. So without further ado, let's move on to C tier. At number 7, we have The Killing. The Killing is a really fun take on a heist film. The film is about 5 guys who concoct a scheme to rob a racetrack. The story begins with the introduction to the 5 guys and their meeting where they hatch the plan and go over the plan of how to steal the money from the racetrack. Everything seems fine until one of the men's wives starts asking about the money, and then you quickly realize that her and her lover are going to steal the money from them. Stanley Kubrick really sets up the anticipation for each scene in the previous scene. Each scene leads into the next one so fluidly in The Killing that you feel like you're constantly moving the narrative forward. Stanley Kubrick really highlights the ill-virtued nature of crimes like these. They ultimately fail in the very end. The performances are really strong. The narrative is really unique and exciting. When you think one thing's going to happen, the next scene introduces a new idea or twist that makes you second guess yourself as to where the story is going. The Killing is a really tight, cut and dry robbery story. I think anyone who likes these type of heist movies should definitely check out The Killing. At number 6, we have Paths of Glory. I think Paths of Glory is a superior war film to Full Metal Jacket. I think Paths of Glory conveys the brutality and the arrogance of war better than Full Metal Jacket. Kirk Douglas is defending these soldiers that are on trial because his squad retreated and failed to attack the enemy when they realized that it would be foolish to attack the enemy. And the army wants to make an example out of them, which shows you the brutality and the cruelty of the institutions of war. This Stanley Kubrick film especially really hones in on the camaraderie of manhood to your fellow man and being a good person to your fellow man. Kirk Douglas gives a really good performance. The story is about the army managing expectations and doing what it thinks is the right thing to do in the right appearance and look for the army. But obviously you're supposed to understand that the army attempting to put these guys on trial and execute them is ill-intended and stupid. This film is about how being too prideful and caring about your own image will ultimately be a negative quality to your life. Paths of Glory is a really cool and different war film that's more of a trial standard courtroom drama and less of a war film. I think this production design of the scenes in the bunkers and the long shots inside the trenches in Paths of Glory are really strong, and you can kind of see the influence of those shots in films like 1917. I think Paths of Glory has more heart to a war story than Full Metal Jacket does. I just really like Paths of Glory. I think technically it's not as flawed as some of the other films we talked about. What can you really say that's bad about it? I think having it black and white isn't that bad and honestly probably preferred. The performances are really good. The story's really good. The emotions and the drama is really good. The stakes are there. The script's there. The cinematography and the direction is really there. There's nothing else to really be said about Paths of Glory. Now we're going on to B tier. B tier I think is very quintessential Stanley Kubrick. These are some of my personal favorite Stanley Kubrick films. The only difference that separates them from A and S tier is that I don't think B tier is perfect. I think these are probably some of the strongest Stanley Kubrick films out there. I think these films give Stanley Kubrick the opportunity to really showcase some of his ideas and creative visions for telling a story. I just don't think these films are necessarily perfect. I can see having some complaints about one or two things about these films, but I have strong personal feelings towards these films, and I identify with these films more than I do with the other Stanley Kubrick films. For that reason, they're on B tier, but since they're not quote unquote perfect, they will not be on A or S tier. With that being said, let's move on to A tier. At number 5, we have Barry Lyndon. Barry Lyndon is about this Irishman who marries this English widow and is now in charge of her estate in the 18th century. The film is really epic. It's over 3 hours long. It's really impressive visually, considering the entire film only uses natural light, which is really impressive. And you can kind of see it in the film. The natural light and the softness the lighting has on the character's skin really adds another dimension to the film language. The film is about a man who gets everything he wants, but as a result, his life becomes worse. We see him slowly becoming more corrupt and making poor decisions and becoming more aggressive and angry. The film has very cool 18th century scenes, like when characters duel. There's multiple duels in this film, which I think is something that I just personally find really funny and interesting and enjoyable to watch. The costumes in this film are spectacular. I think the drama is very sophisticated and nuanced, more nuanced than any other Stanley Kubrick movie, and this is probably Stanley Kubrick's most beautiful movie, in my opinion. The scenery of the landscapes are really a marvel to look at, and the 18th century English architecture is also something to marvel at. It's really, really beautiful film. You really appreciate the time Stanley Kubrick dedicates to Barry Lyndon himself as a character. Barry Lyndon might have some problems to some people, like someone might say it's too long. It is his second longest movie. It's his second 3 hour long movie. It's 3 hours and 5 minutes. And I think Spartacus is 3 hours and 17 minutes. Even though Barry Lyndon is long, I think the length of the film adds to the complexity of the story and is appropriate. Whereas I know some really long films just feel long for the sake of feeling long. Barry Lyndon feels long with a purpose. At number 4, we have The Shining. The Shining is a really strange but brilliant film. Jack Nicholson is an author who agrees to watch the Overlook Hotel for the winter season with his wife, played by Shelley Duvall, and his son. But the problem is, the hotel was built on an ancient Indian burial ground, and there's been past murders and crimes in the hotel, and you discover that through the little boy, because Jack Nicholson's son has this ability called Shining, where he's able to communicate with spirits of the Overlook Hotel, and Jack Nicholson also is able to communicate with them, but the spirits end up corrupting him, whereas his son is able to communicate them more effectively through his Shining. Jack Nicholson eventually becomes insane and murderous and tries to kill Shelley Duvall and the child, but they're able to escape at the last second. But you're really scared for them because it's just them and Jack Nicholson at the hotel by themselves in a snowstorm. So you're really creeped out by that, and it's really intense. And Kubrick does something different with this film, where I think there's more of a stillness, and I think he uses the vastness of the space of the Overlook Hotel to kind of convey that stillness and that kind of emptiness and aloneness that really adds to the fear of the film. The performances in this film, I think, are spectacular. I think Jack Nicholson is completely bonkers in this film, but it totally works. And I know some people hate on Shelley Duvall's performance, especially because of Stanley Kubrick's abuse towards her during the production of this movie. But I think it's really engaging. I think she does a phenomenal job in this role. She seems genuinely petrified when Jack Nicholson is trying to kill her, and it's one of those things. It's one of those moments of acting that you are just totally bought into. You're totally bought into the performance, I believe, with Shelley Duvall. It's absolutely fantastic. There are some things that from the book that are cut from the movie, but are sometimes added to the movie in weird ways that don't make a whole lot of sense. I understand that criticism. I understand the criticism with the technical aspects of shooting this film, considering there were shots where you saw helicopters that you weren't supposed to see and stuff like that. I just think the strangeness of the story is something that really benefits from Stanley Kubrick directing it. Or Stanley Kubrick is really given a strong opportunity to convey some of his creative thematic ideas because of the way he is able to show ghosts. He's able to show perspectives in ways that are unique to the story and his other films. And I think The Shining is one of the most creative ways to tell a horror story, and it's probably one of the best horror movies of all time. At number 3, we have Eyes Wide Shut. In the Stanley Kubrick filmography, the Eyes Wide Shut might be the most controversial of Stanley Kubrick's movies, because Stanley Kubrick died before they finished the edit of the film. So when this movie came out, you were left to wonder Was this how Stanley Kubrick intended the film to be? I still think, nonetheless, this is a Stanley Kubrick film. He was involved in the creation of the film, and he directed the entire filming of Eyes Wide Shut. For the most part, I believe. Tom Cruise going on a sexual odyssey one night after his wife, Nicole Kidman, reveals that she's unfulfilled and not satisfied with Tom Cruise. So Tom Cruise goes on a sexual adventure. He ends up almost cheating on his wife with another woman, but ends up not cheating on her with her anyway. He runs into his musician friend who offers him a secret invite to this party that he's going to, and when he goes to the party, he's masked, and then he realizes that the party is not what he initially thought it would be, and it's a very sexually driven party, and he's kind of quite shocked by it. He's kind of shocked by the taboo nature of it, shocked by the scale and scope of it, and the conspiracy of it all. This is one of Stanley Kubrick's most out there films, and this is one of Stanley Kubrick's most sexual films. This film's biggest theme is sex, and the role sex plays in your life, and how important it is for your life. I think that's a very interesting topic for a film that's not usually talked about a lot, which is unique and interesting. The story's good. The performances are good. It's just a personal preference that I like this film. I think this film takes a lot of creative risks that I think really pay off. One of my favorite parts about Stanley Kubrick films are the creative risks that he takes. So seeing Eyes Wide Shut was a very enjoyable experience, and for that reason, it's ranked at number 3 for my Stanley Kubrick ranking. The one film on A tier is a perfect film, but because it's not one of the quote-unquote greatest films of all time and transcended the film and cinema history as we know it, is why it's just one tier below the top tiered movie. So at number 2, the only film in A tier, we have Doctor Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. I did a video like about a year and a half ago where I made the argument that Doctor Strangelove should have beat My Fair Lady for Best Picture. I know some people disagreed with me, but I easily stand by that opinion. Doctor Strangelove is a phenomenal film. It's actually surprisingly really funny for a film that doesn't have that much quote-unquote jokes. The film is about this general who orders this massive airstrike on the Soviet Union that would create nuclear holocaust and kill all life on Earth as we know it. He did that because he's going insane and believing that the Soviet Union, quote-unquote, stole their bodily fluids. And in order to protect their bodily fluids, he launches a massive airstrike on the Soviet Union. The president is in the war room trying to figure out a way to save the situation and save life on Earth. And you're kind of just left baffled at the stupidity of all these important government officials, and it's supposed to be really funny to see them fumble around in this really high stakes serious situation that is unfolding in the most ridiculous way. It's a very smart commentary on the military industrial complex and the failure of institutions. The film is strong because there's multiple perspectives that are all equally interesting. The performances are also spectacular, especially Peter Sellers, who plays 3 different characters. Nothing more can be said about Doctor Strangelove. It's just a fun, witty film that I think is really strong. I'm always massively enjoying myself whenever I watch Doctor Strangelove. Go watch Doctor Strangelove. It's fantastic. At number 1, and the only film on S tier, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. 2001: A Space Odyssey is the greatest sci-fi movie of all time. The film is separated into 4 parts, but it's really the middle 2 parts, part 2 and part 3, that feel more like a traditional movie with a traditional narrative. And the beginning and end of the film feel more abstract and more experimental. Mainly, the film starts from the dawn of man all the way to the future in 2001. The music choices in the film are iconic. The way Kubrick tells the story in this film is the most creative way I've ever seen anyone tell a story. He's able to create a narrative but not even have any real characters introduced until over half an hour into the film. Yet, the beginning of the film still works because you're realizing the smallness of our main characters towards the greater scheme of the larger story and the larger themes of the film that Stanley Kubrick is trying to convey. HAL 9000 is one of the best villains in all of American cinema. It's a really cool concept about the failure of technology and putting your faith in technology as opposed to putting your faith in human ingenuity. How reliant people are to tools and how tools are so important for people to function in the modern world. This film is even more relevant now than it was in 1968. I like the lingering shots and I like the emptiness of space. I like the abstract nature of the ending. The ending with all the different colors is very psychedelic and very cool and one of the most unique things I've ever seen in film. I even like the other dimension part near the very end where he's seeing his older self. I think that was a very creative way to show passage of time in an alternate universe. I think the tension during the HAL 9000 part is the best part of the movie, obviously. The astronauts trying to get back into the spaceship, but HAL won't open the pod bay doors is absolutely chilling. And it's so epic. And it's so engaging. And you're left there with our characters wondering what's going to happen. The beginning montage when the ape first discovers how to use a bone as a tool and a weapon is one of the most iconic things in film history. One of the strongest cuts in cinema history. This film is just absolutely flawless. It's beautiful. Stanley Kubrick won an Oscar for visual effects for this film. I cannot stress how perfect this movie is. This film changed the way people viewed films. This film changed the way filmmakers approached telling a story. After this film, they took more risks. They wanted to tell stories with less words, with less characters, with less traditional structures. And this film is everything but traditional. And it still works. Stanley Kubrick is a masterful director. His use of one-point perspective in this film particularly is astounding. Please check out 2001: A Space Odyssey. It is easily, by far, Stanley Kubrick's best film and one of the best films ever made. That does it for my tier list of Stanley Kubrick films. Tell me what your favorite Stanley Kubrick film is down in the comments. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you stay up to date on all new upcoming content. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.